Right, before we move on to the applications in zone 1, we've got a couple of reports to consider. The first report is the consideration of planning applications on this agenda.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, in presenting this report, you asked if I could also put something visually on the screen that I could talk members through, just to make sure it was clear to all members and everybody in the room exactly how the scene is set, if you like, for the decisions that are going to take place subsequently. So if I could just ask Peter to put the first screen up for me. So this really looks at how members dealt with these greenfield applications previously. So you've dealt with a number of these applications, the first in January up until the middle of July this year. And so under the planning legislation, as a planning committee, you're required to decide planning applications in accordance with development plans, unless material considerations determine otherwise. And our most relevant development plans here are the core strategy and our local plan part 2. So that's your starting point for making decisions. Within that is set out in the report. There's some policies that on the face of it are slightly in conflict, and we've got policies which protect the countryside. But we've also got a very key policy which is DSP 40, which basically says if it can be demonstrated that this council doesn't have enough housing land supply, private housing land supply, it can permit housing in the countryside subject to criteria being met. So Fox has concluded that when you look at the plan in the whole, it can apply to the policies of those plans. You've then got what's called material considerations, and that could be a wide range of things that are directly related to the use of land and planning. And one of the most significant material considerations is the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF, as it's shortened on the screen, and that came out in 2012, the version that we were looking at the time. The general thrust of the NPPF, was that housing should be permitted as a drive for the government to deliver more housing, and that was the ambitions behind that document. Within it, it had a particular part which got colloquially called the tilted balance. The tilted balance is actually one particular paragraph in that document, and that is something that you as members take into account when you decided all those planning applications. And it's called the tilted balance colloquially because it effectively tips the balance in favour of applicants going forward to develop sites. So if you've got policies that are either out of date, or you can't, as a council, demonstrate you've got sufficient land, then the presumption is that you should grant planning permission unless the harm of doing so outweighs any benefits. And that was really the starting place for the tilted balance. So, in very simple summary, and I'm happy to take questions after I show you the second screen, that's how members work through these decisions over the year before July. So I'll just ask you to bring up the second one. So this is how it's going to work today. So the fundamental starting place is still the same. It's the development plans. We've still got to take into account all the material planning considerations. Since you considered these applications previously, the National Planning Policy Framework has been revised, it was revised in late July. And the emphasis of that document is actually not to restrict housing, it's to put greater emphasis on its delivery. The government's made it clear it wants to see more houses delivered across the country, so it's put more emphasis on permitting housing and delivering housing. However, as a consequence of something completely separate, that was a decision by the European courts, if there's a need for appropriate assessment to be undertaken, the National Planning Policy Framework actually says that that tilted balance that you previously took into account no longer applies. And that is the fundamental main reason these applications are acted for you today. The legal advice is that members quite rightly took something into account when they first made these decisions. Formal decision notices haven't been issued, they're still subject to legal agreements that are being worked on at the moment. And the legal landscape, the planning landscape has now changed. So if we were to carry on and issue those planning permissions that you previously considered in the form you considered them, that they're arguably legally flawed. You relied on something called tilted balance, which no longer applies. So at that point, Chairman, I'm happy to pause and then to clarify any points about it, but that's the fundamental difference between decisions before July and decisions now.
Members?
Councillor Durham. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your very clear and coherent explanation, which I have wondered about, as you know. What concerns me is that I came into this planning committee in 1980. We're talking about 3 or 4 decades ago. And in those days, we could make decisions based on the then local plan and so on. It seems to me now we're in a different situation where we are powerless. We have the NPPF, we now have the CJEU, and basically we no longer have the power to make decisions solely on what we regard, like your lobby, as being the appropriate planning decisions. Now, this evening, or this afternoon, we're going through again applications that were rejected last time, were approved last time. Now, I thank the members of the public for coming today, and I hope you'll find it interesting. But essentially, we are discussing applications that have been approved, and we have to decide whether the assessment, in the light of assessment in the light of CJEU, still means that they should be approved. But it would seem to me that the balance, if you like, not tilted balance, the ordinary balance, probably suggests that there's not been a material change. And it's only the material change that we're here to discuss today. We're not here to discuss the whole issue again of these particular applications. But I do feel, and I feel this very strongly, that I'm wondering now, after 30 odd years on this committee, whether I can perform any useful function on this committee, or whether we're so constrained that we may just as well go ahead and say, yeah, okay, we'll agree to them all. So I'm not very happy. Thank you.
That's Ford.
Thanks for that, Lee. You'll recall that I dropped a note to you and I copied all of the members on clarification of the legal guidance. I don't know if you're going to go a step further and just clarify the legal guidance, because I was somewhat confused by that, and I took very much a layman's logical view and I was struggling with it. You have since supplied more substantial information that makes a bit more sense, so I don't know if it might be helpful if we could just go a step further and explain that legal guidance.
I'm happy to do that, Chairman. So the legal guidance particularly relates to the part at the bottom there, tilted balance, in that the legal advice is, when you read the documents on their face, the tilted balance no longer applies. However, like all things in this life, it's potentially open to legal challenge. There is challenges to that approach elsewhere in the country that we're aware of. And so the legal advice is effectively to firstly make the decision without taking the tilted balance into account, and then secondly, to then apply the tilted balance and also consider what the outcome of doing so is. So in each of the reports, we've made the decision or recommendation without taking into account the tilted balance, and then we've applied it. And what you'll find is, or what we found is, that if you, without the tilted balance in place, if you consider that planning permission should be granted, once you apply the tilted balance, your decision will always be the same, because it tips in favour forever of the applicant, so it can only go, in our view, almost only one way. So the legal position is, if you do both, then that means that the decision is legally robust.
Councillor Price.
Can I just ask, Lee, is that we're considering these applications this afternoon because there's been a change in regulations, law, call it what you like, since we actually made a decision on them. And the officers were negotiating the necessary legal agreements with the applicants, and therefore the plans, the actual full planning consent, although we had agreed it as a committee, had not been issued. Now, could we still be in the same sort of situation? Is that today we will make a decision based on what we know as at today, and then somebody changes something in a week's time, and we have the applications back again. This seems to me to be a ludicrous situation, because surely when the planning committee makes a decision, That whether you agree with it or whether it's right or it's wrong, that's what is being, decision is being made. Just because there's been a procedure to go through to get the final details sorted out with the applicant, that surely shouldn't come into the equation, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
To establish a case law that the data determination of any planning applications when the council actually physically issues the planning decision notice to grant planning permission or refusal. And therefore it's just a matter of natural justice really, that if any significant material planning considerations change or come about, then it's appropriate that the council reconsider them. And in this instance, it was considered that the differences were so substantial that members of the planning committee should consider those relevant officers.
Councillor.
Struggling to understand this. I'm going to try and tell you what I interpreted and tell me, correct me if I'm wrong. So my understanding is that we have to carry out the material considerations in respect to there being an appropriate assessment. And that should the appropriate assessment have been applied and mitigation in place, it's then at that point, my understanding is that we then move on and we consider the tilted balance. However, there's a line for tilted balance here, and so that's brought into question of previous understanding. Have I just explained that correctly? Or not?
The appropriate assessment is effectively a technical exercise that's slightly separate from what you see on the screen. So I'm happy, if you'd like me to talk about appropriate assessment now, that'll help. I'm happy to talk about it at this stage. So what we're required to do as authorities, decision makers, is look at whether there could be potential significant effects on European sites. And European sites are things such as special protection areas. These are areas of the coastline that are protected for overwintering birds, and that surrounds the whole of our borough. So like the River Hamble, they're right along the Solent, they also go into Portsmouth Harbour. So they're close to all of our borough, basically. They can be affected by population growth, extra people living in the area. So the worry is that the more houses you grant, the more people live in the area. If they're close to the coast, there's more likelihood they'll visit it. When they visit it, whether they're doing water sports or they're walking dogs, whatever it might be, it could create that additional disturbance and that can have an effect. And that's what the appropriate assessment is about. It's looking at what the effect cumulatively might be and then how that might be mitigated. So before, it was almost at the first stage. It was called the screening stage before. So when you were first asked, might this have a significant effect? All of us over here would say yes. But we've got a strategy in place, we can mitigate it. The court said you can't do that anymore, you can't just stop at the screening stage, you actually look at a full assessment and then decide what the mitigation should be. The reality of life is, I'll be very honest about it, the outcome's exactly the same in Fairham. It's got a very good strategy, a very thorough strategy, it's agreed with a whole host of bodies, other local authorities, Natural England, RSPB. The outcome is still actually the same, but we have now done detailed assessments on every one of those applications, which has confirmed that mitigation is what we suggested to you previously as a tax out.
Anybody else? Right, members.
Sorry, Chairman. Also, I think it's appropriate at this stage, sorry, got my phone back on, is that you'll see there's an update list as well for this afternoon's meeting, and what I'm afraid I don't know, so I apologise to members now, is that a letter's been received by us from Harrison Grant solicitors on behalf of Save Warsash and Western Wards. I believe it's been circulated to some members, but I'm not sure how many members have actually seen copies of it. I'll see from nods, it looks like all. Okay, in which case I probably don't need to talk pretty much away, which I've taken the paraphrase on the basis that members have seen that. But we have discussed this very carefully with our planning solicitors. We're satisfied that the reports that you've got before in each application are legally, procedurally robust. And within this update sheet, you've actually then set out our responses to the key points that have been raised, which is in particular to explain how we've dealt with the appropriate assessments, the fact they have been undertaken for all the applications, they have been displayed on our website. Members have got hard copies of them if they should wish to see those as well. They're referred to within the covering report, within individual reports, essentially, although you've got a copy there of every appropriate assessment for every planning application, the same issue applies to every single application. It's the same fundamental issue. So to say they're similar is probably a polite understatement. They're effectively identical, as is the mitigation that they conclude. So that sets out facts one. It also confirms Natural England's position, and they confirm to us that they don't object to the appropriate assessments on the basis that we are mitigating all that effect on the special protection areas through that financial contribution. And then we go on to say that one of the other points that was raised was that it's not clear that each application has been reconsidered in full in light of changes in policy and law. Well, likely that's the decision you as members are about to make on each of the applications before you this afternoon. We believe you've got the information there to do that. And there was also reference that they believe that one of the policies was incorrectly titled, and we believe actually is correct. It is PSB 40 is housing allocations, we believe that part's correct. So our advice to you is there are no grounds in which to delay making decisions on those applications. Thank you, Chairman.
Does anyone want to comment? Councillor?
Thank you. Thanks, Lee. Perhaps I could just go back to the previous point then, that I guess it's going to be more of a discussion point for us if when you did your assessment, not considering the tilted balance, if that was, well, we would refuse on that basis, we'd recommend refusal, but then applying the tilted balance, that tips it the other way to say we now recommend permission. That would be more of an issue, but as I read it, you're recommending permission both pre-tilted balance and post-tilted balance. But we'd have more of a discussion if it was a split between them. Am I reading that correctly? And I assume as well, I guess it's stating the obvious, that every local authority that finds themselves in the same position as we are around the coastline will have the same legal advice as we've had. There's nothing unique about Fareham that would differentiate the legal advice that we've had. Question mark.
I'll answer that one, but I'll let Alex come in if need be. I suppose I can't say that to all, but I can say for a number of the Hampshire authorities, because there's 15 authorities that form part of the solar recreation mitigation strategy. So in their case, they've got a very definitive, we've got something in place, we're arranged, we'll sort of anticipate this issue, we can address it. I can't say that it would be in common for all authorities across England.
Thank you.
Yes. So to come back to the point I made earlier, now that you've presented that the appropriate assessments have all been undertaken, my understanding is that we then move to this para 177, which then says that we do then take into account the lack of the 5-year housing land supply in determining the outcome. That's how I interpret it. Is that correct? My correct understanding?
Well, the way it worked is that the European Court judgment basically said that councils have got to do an appropriate assessment. You can't circumvent it, you can't try and deal with it at an earlier stage. So there's a need for appropriate assessments on every housing application pretty much in this borough because of its proximity to the coast. What the paragraph 177 of the NPPF says is if there is an appropriate assessment, if there's a requirement for an appropriate assessment, I've paraphrased it somewhat, but effectively the tilted balance then does not apply. I'm over-paraphrasing that. That's not a sort of a legal definition I'm giving you. But effectively, that removes the tilted balance. But I'm quite heavily paraphrasing that. I'll put a caveat on that. That's why it's gone.
And if I may, you can turn to page 24 of the report, page 19. It sets it out in full. I should also add the shortfall of the housing land supply is still a relative consideration.
Exactly.
But it's a different one.
I'm happy.
Okay. Right, anybody else? Anyone else? Okay, we're asked to report. Is this agreed?